Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The letter had been sitting on the corner of Wolfe's desk for 3 days before he agreed to see the man who wrote it. And when Emmett Vance finally sat in the red leather chair across from that acreage of desk, I understood why Wolfe had hesitated. Vance had the look of a man who'd spent 40 years being careful. And careful men make wearying clients. They circle. They qualify. They spend the first 20 minutes deciding how much truth the situation actually requires. I had pegged him from the letter alone. The paper was heavy stock. The letterhead read Vance and Ashford, Investment Counsel, and the handwriting underneath the typed body was cramped and controlled, the hand of a man who distrusted flourishes. Now, in the flesh, he confirmed it. Gray suit, gray tie, gray at the temples, and eyes that kept finding the orchids on the shelves along the wall, as though he couldn't decide whether they were reassuring or absurd. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me. I haven't yet agreed to anything beyond an audience," Wolfe said. He was behind his desk in the only chair built to hold him properly, hands folded over the slope of his vest, and his tone had the particular flatness he reserved for people who hadn't yet justified his attention. "You wrote that a man named Sheldon Corliss died 3 weeks ago, and that the police have called it an accident. You did not write why you doubt them, only that you do. I find incomplete letters irritating. Complete your thought, Mr. Vance, or don't waste further time." I was at my desk, pretending to review correspondence, which is to say, I was watching Vance's hands. They'd gone to his knee and gripped it, the kind of grip a man uses to keep something else, his voice maybe, or his composure, from doing something unruly. "Corliss was my partner," Vance said. 31 years. He fell down the service stairs at his own building on a Tuesday night, cracked his skull on the concrete landing, and the medical examiner said it was consistent with a fall taken while intoxicated. "Sheldon didn't drink, Mr. Wolfe. Not in 31 years did I see that man take more than a single glass of sherry at a client dinner, and only then because refusing it insulted the client." "Men change habits," Wolfe said. "Grief, illness, the erosions of age. 31 years is a long enough acquaintance to have missed a slow drift toward the bottle." I'd have noticed a drift. What I noticed instead was a blood alcohol level a medical examiner put at 0.18, which is not a drift, Mr. Wolfe, that is a flood. And Sheldon Corliss could not have produced that level of intoxication without someone either forcing liquor into him or pouring it into him after he was already unconscious. Vance's careful voice had picked up an edge, finally, the first honest sound he'd made since sitting down. "The police interviewed the building staff, found no witnesses, ruled it accidental, and closed the file within a week. I don't believe them, and I don't have the standing or the temperament to prove otherwise myself. That's why I'm here." Wolfe's eyes had drifted half shut, which with him is not disinterest, but its opposite. The look he gets when a problem has started to interest the part of his mind that never really rests, the part underneath the orchids and the beer, and the elaborate unwillingness to leave his own house. Who inherits his portion of the firm? I do. We had a survivorship agreement, standard among partners. His share of Vance and Ashford passes to me and to David Ashford, our third partner, in equal division. Then you had motive. Vance didn't flinch, which told me something. A guilty man startles at that sentence, even when he's rehearsed his innocence. An innocent man who has already had the thought occur to him, and made his peace with it, answers the way Vance did, tired, not defensive. "I've had 3 weeks to consider that I'm the obvious suspect, Mr. Wolfe. I'm 61 years old. I have more money than I know what to do with already, and Sheldon Corliss was the closest thing to a brother I've had since my own brother died in Korea. I want to know who did, and I'm prepared to pay handsomely for the answer. Because the alternative is living the rest of my life next to a man's death that nobody bothered to actually investigate." There was a silence then, the kind Wolfe likes to let sit, so a client feels the weight of it. Outside on 35th Street, a truck downshifted with a sound like a bear clearing its throat. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. Who else stood to gain from Mr. Corliss's death? David Ashford gains a larger share as well, proportionally, though less than I do. There's Corliss's niece, Marion Thale, who I understand was the sole beneficiary of his personal estate outside the firm. The brownstone he owned on 63rd, some investments, and there was a matter, which I confess I only half understand, involving a company called Perryman Textiles, in which Sheldon had made a rather large personal investment against my advice about 8 months ago. I don't know the details. Sheldon had grown private in his last year, which was unlike him. Private, Wolfe repeated, and something in the way he said the word told me he'd caught on to the loose thread before I had. In what respect? He took calls with his office door closed. He traveled twice to Hartford without explaining the purpose. He asked our bookkeeper, rather than me, to review a set of transfers related to Perryman, which was irregular. Sheldon and I reviewed everything together, always. That was the entire foundation of the partnership. Vance's hands had come off his knee finally, spreading in a small, helpless gesture. I don't know what he was protecting me from, or protecting himself over, but a man who changes the habits of 31 years in his final 8 months of life was either afraid of something or ashamed of something, and I intend to find out which. Wolfe regarded him for a long moment, and I could see the decision arriving the way I always can, a faint settling of his shoulders, an almost invisible surrender to the fact that his curiosity had outpaced his indolence. He rang for beer. "Your fee will be substantial," he said, "and my methods will not resemble the police department's. I do not chase men through service stairwells, Mr. Vance. I sit in this chair, I listen, and eventually the truth arrives, because it has nowhere else left to go. Archie will require a list. Everyone at the firm, everyone in Mr. Corliss's family, everyone connected to this Perryman Textiles matter, and the name of the bookkeeper you mentioned." "Dolores Feeney," Vance said. "She's been with the firm 11 years. Archie." Wolfe's eyes came to me, heavy-lidded and satisfied in the way of a man who has just traded 3 days of restlessness for a problem worth chewing. "Get the particulars. Mr. Vance, you will forgive me. It is nearly luncheon, and Fritz has prepared shad roe, which does not improve with delay." Vance rose, looking faintly bewildered by the abruptness of his dismissal, which is a look I've watched 100 clients wear on their way out of that office. I walked him to the hall myself, took down the details he had, names, dates, the address of the building where Corliss had died, the direct line for a lieutenant named Pearlie Stebbins, who'd apparently caught the case before it got waved off as accidental. And by the time I came back to the office, Wolfe was already halfway to the dining room, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who believed, correctly as it turned out, that lunch was the most urgent matter currently before him. I stood in the office a moment longer, looking at the space where Vance's chair still held the faint impression of a careful man carrying an uncareful grief, and thought that somewhere in Hartford, or in a shuttered office with the door closed against his own partner of 31 years, Sheldon Corliss had gone looking for something that got him killed instead. It was, I decided, going to be a good one. By 4 o'clock the next afternoon, I had David Ashford sitting in the office, and I had already decided I didn't like him, which is not the same thing as deciding he was a murderer, but it's a start. He was younger than Vance by a good 15 years, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of tan that comes from a membership rather than a vacation, and a handshake he held a half-second too long, as though letting go first would concede some point in an argument nobody else knew they were having. He'd worn a suit that cost more than my first 3 months at Wolfe's, and he sat in the red leather chair like he was evaluating whether to make an offer on it. "I have to say," Ashford opened, before Wolfe had said a word beyond a greeting, "I find this whole exercise a little distasteful. Emmett's grieving, and grief makes people see conspiracies and accidents." Sheldon fell down a flight of stairs. "It happens." "It happens," Wolfe agreed, "to men who are drunk, infirm, or unlucky. Mr. Vance asserts Mr. Corliss was none of those things habitually. Do you dispute his intoxication was out of character? I dispute that any of us really know what's in character for a man in his final year. Ashford crossed one leg over the other, unhurried, a man used to being the most comfortable person in any room he entered. Sheldon had gotten strange, Mr. Wolfe. Secretive. He'd cut Emmett out of decisions they used to make together for 3 decades. And frankly, if you want my honest reading of it, I think Sheldon was drinking a great deal more than either of us realized, because a man doesn't otherwise start making the kind of mistakes he was making. That stopped me mid-note-taking. What mistakes? I said, because Wolfe hadn't gotten there yet, and I wasn't going to let a good opening evaporate. Ashford glanced at me the way men like him glance at hired help. Not unkindly, just briefly, the way you'd glance at a clock. Financial ones. Sheldon put $400,000 of personal money into a textile operation in Hartford called Perryman, against my advice, and apparently without telling Emmett at all, which I only discovered after his death, when I went through his files to help settle the partnership accounts. Perryman Textiles is, as far as I've since learned, a company with more debt than looms. It's the kind of investment a man makes when he isn't thinking clearly, or when someone's convinced him of something that isn't true. Who introduced him to this investment? I don't know. He never discussed it with me. That's rather the point, Mr. Wolfe. Sheldon Corliss discussed everything with his partners, until suddenly he didn't, and 3 months after he stopped, he was dead. Ashford spread his hands, and for the first time something under the polish showed itself. Not grief exactly, but a kind of irritation, as though Corliss's death were an inconvenience that had disrupted an otherwise orderly life. I don't say that to be callous. I say it because I think Emmett has built an elaborate story out of a man's private unraveling, and I'd rather see the truth acknowledged than watch my partner spend a fortune chasing a murderer who doesn't exist. Wolfe's eyes had gone to slits again. You inherit a portion of Mr. Corliss's share of the firm. So does Emmett, and in greater proportion. If you're building a case on inheritance, Mr. Wolfe, he's your man before I am, and I'd remind you he's also the one who hired you, which strikes me as either very brave or very stupid for a guilty party. Or very clever, Wolfe murmured, for a man confident no evidence exists to find. Ashford smiled thinly and didn't answer that, which I noted, and which I suspected Wolfe noted twice as hard. Marion Thale arrived at 6, and she was nothing like her uncle's partners. Younger, maybe 30, dressed simply with the kind of face that had clearly been crying recently, and clearly didn't want anyone to mention it. She sat forward in the red chair rather than back, hands knotted in her lap, and when Wolfe offered condolences in that formal, oddly gentle way he has with genuine grief, something in her shoulders loosened slightly. Uncle Sheldon practically raised me, she said. My parents divorced when I was 9, and he was the one who— She stopped, recomposed. I'm sorry, you didn't ask for that. I asked for nothing yet, Wolfe said. Take your time, Miss Thale. He left me the house on 63rd Street, and some investments. I don't know the value yet. The lawyers are still working through it. I want to say now, before you ask, that I don't need his money, Mr. Wolfe. I have my own position. I teach mathematics at a girls' school in Riverdale. And I would give every dollar of that inheritance back tomorrow, if it meant he'd walk down those stairs again and not fall. Nobody has accused you of avarice, Wolfe said, though I confess the thought had crossed my mind that grief and greed occasionally cohabit in the same heart without contradiction. Tell me about the last months of his life. Mr. Vance and Mr. Ashford both describe a man grown private. Marion was quiet a moment, twisting a ring on her finger. He was frightened, she said finally. Not the way you'd think. Not jumpy, not looking over his shoulder. Quieter than that. Like a man doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't like the answer to. I asked him about it in April over dinner, and he said— She stopped again, and this time when she continued her voice had dropped, as if she were reporting a confidence she felt guilty repeating. He said, "Marion, I did something foolish for a friend, and I'm not sure yet whether it was foolish because it was wrong, or foolish because I got caught being right. I didn't understand it, Ben. I still don't." I wrote that down word for word, because it was the first thing anyone had said all day that sounded less like a rehearsed position and more like a man's actual voice, ventriloquized through his niece's memory. Did he name the friend? No, I asked. He changed the subject the way he always did when he decided a conversation was over. He'd start talking about orchids, or ask after my students, and you learn not to push past that wall with Uncle Sheldon. I regret that now. I regret every conversation where I let him close a door instead of forcing it open. Her eyes had gone bright again, and she blinked hard, jaw tight. Whatever he did, Mr. Wolfe, I don't believe he did it for himself. He wasn't a selfish man. If he took a risk, it was because someone he cared about needed him to. Wolfe let that sit a moment, the way he does when a sentence has more weight in it than its speaker realizes. "One further question," he said. "Are you familiar with a company called Perryman Textiles?" Marion's brow creased, genuinely, I thought. There's a particular quality to real confusion that's hard to counterfeit. A small delay before the face settles into a reaction. No. Should I be? "Perhaps not yet," Wolfe said, and rang for beer, which meant the interview, as far as he was concerned, had run its useful course. I saw her out myself, and on the stoop she paused, looking back up at the brownstone's dark brick front, the way people do when they're deciding whether to say one more thing. "He didn't drink, Mr. Goodwin," she said. "Whatever the papers say, my uncle didn't drink, and I don't care what proportion of his blood the medical examiner measured. Somebody put it there." I told her Mr. Wolfe didn't waste his fee on cases that had already answered themselves, which was true enough to be reassuring, without being a promise, and watched her walk toward 9th Avenue, with her shoulders set, like a woman who'd decided, somewhere in that office, that she believed in us. Back inside, Wolfe was at his desk with his eyes closed, lips moving in and out, in that small rhythmic pucker that meant a thought had lodged somewhere, and was being turned over like a stone in a creek bed. "A foolish thing done for a friend," he said, without opening his eyes. And a bookkeeper who reviewed transfers her employer usually reviewed himself. "Archie, tomorrow you will find Dolores Feeney, and I suspect, before you do, that you should also find out precisely what Perryman Textiles manufactures, who owns it, and why a cautious man who discussed everything with his partners for 31 years suddenly discussed nothing at all." "On it," I said. "You want Stebbins too?" He caught the case. "Not yet." Wolfe's eyes opened, and there was something almost pleased in them, the particular satisfaction he takes in a puzzle that has just revealed it has more pieces than anyone bothered to count. "Pearlie will tell us what the department concluded. I would rather first discover what the department never thought to ask." Perryman Textiles, it turned out, was easy to find and hard to understand, which is often the sign of a company built more for concealment than for weaving cloth. I spent the morning on the phone and in the county clerk's records before I turned up much, but by noon I had the shape of it. Perryman Textiles operated out of a mill building in Hartford that had, according to a Connecticut business journal from 18 months back, laid off 60% of its workforce and defaulted on a loan from a regional bank. The company's principal owner of record was a man named Walter Grissom, but a secondary filing, the kind clerks file and nobody reads, showed a silent investor group behind Grissom holding a majority interest through a holding company called Fairhaven Partners. Fairhaven's registered agent was a law firm 2 blocks from Vance and Ashford's own offices. That struck me as the kind of coincidence Wolfe doesn't believe in. So I called Lon Cohen at the Gazette, who owed me enough favors to make the exchange feel less like extraction and more like conversation. "Perryman Textiles," Lon said, after I'd waded through the sound of him rifling a drawer. "Rings a bell for a bad reason. There was a piece 6-7 months back, small item, business section, about a labor dispute. Workers claiming they'd been promised the company was stabilizing, about to get an infusion of capital that would save the jobs. And then 2 months later the layoffs hit anyway. There was talk that capital infusion happened but got, let's say, redirected before it reached payroll. Nothing ever came of it, no charges. The reporter who had it moved to Chicago before he finished the story, and nobody picked it back up. $400,000 worth of infusion, maybe. Could be. I don't have a number in front of me. Why, Archie? What have you got? I told him not yet, which is what I always tell Lon, and hung up with the uncomfortable feeling that Sheldon Corliss's foolish thing done for a friend might have been $400,000, poured into a company that used it for something other than its workers. And that somebody connected to that money might have had a very good reason not to want Corliss discussing it with his partners, or with anyone else. Dolores Feeney I found at the firm's offices on Madison, a compact woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and the wary, precise manner of someone who has spent 11 years being the only person in a building who actually knows where the money goes. She didn't want to talk in the office, said Mr. Ashford didn't like her taking personal time for outside matters, which was itself a small data point worth keeping. So we ended up at a coffee counter around the corner, and it took 2 cups before she loosened up. Mr. Corliss asked me to route the Perryman transfers directly, without going through the usual approval chain, she said finally, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking. That's not how we do things. Every significant transfer gets initialed by both partners. That's the whole structure of the firm, Mr. Goodwin. It's why clients trust us. But Mr. Corliss came to me himself, in April, and said this one was personal, not a firm matter, and he'd appreciate my discretion. Did that seem strange to you? Everything about it seemed strange. Sheldon Corliss was the most orderly man I ever worked for. He color-coded his own desk calendar. And here he was asking me to move $400,000 through a personal account into an entity I'd never heard of, without a paper trail that either of his partners would see. She glanced up at me, and there was something uneasy in it. Guilt, maybe. Or its cousin. I should have said no. I've thought about that every day for 3 weeks, but he was my employer of 11 years, and he asked so quietly, like it mattered to him more than anything, and I did it. Did he say why? He said someone he trusted was in trouble, and that the situation was delicate. That's the word he used. Delicate. I asked if Mr. Vance knew, and he said, she paused, and when she continued her voice had gone smaller. He said Emmett would talk me out of it, and I've already decided. Which frightened me a little, honestly, because Sheldon Corliss never made a decision in 31 years that he hadn't run past Emmett Vance first. That's the whole reason the partnership worked. I asked her about the 2 trips to Hartford, and she confirmed them. Said Corliss had booked his own travel, rather than going through the firm's usual arrangements, which was, again, out of character for a man who otherwise let his life run on rails. One more thing, she said, as I was getting ready to settle the check. About 3 weeks before he died, the week before really, he came into my office and asked me to pull the Perriman file. He looked over the transfer records for close to an hour. Didn't say much, and then he asked me a question I haven't been able to stop thinking about. What he asked? He asked whether a transfer, once made, could be traced back further than the immediate recipient. Whether I could tell where the money went after Perryman received it. She shook her head slowly. I told him I could try, that it would take some digging with the bank, and he said not to bother, that he thought he already knew the answer and didn't like it. He seemed different after that conversation, Mr. Goodwin. Quieter, like something had been confirmed that he'd been hoping wouldn't be. That was Tuesday of the week he died, the following Tuesday, which put the conversation roughly 7 days before Sheldon Corliss went down a flight of service stairs with enough alcohol in him to float a barge. I got Pearlie Stebbins on the phone that afternoon, and he was, as ever, delighted to hear from me in the way a man is delighted by a toothache that at least distracts from the weather. Corliss, he said. Yeah, I caught that one. Accidental fall. M.E. confirmed the intoxication. No signs of struggle. No forced entry to the building. Though hell, Goodwin, it's an office building. People walk in and out all day. Nothing to indicate foul play. Why your fat genius decide it's murder because somebody's paying him to think so? He hasn't decided anything yet, Pearlie. That's not how he operates, and you know it. Was there a full toxicology report? Anything besides the blood alcohol? There was a pause, papers shuffling on his end. Standard talk screen, nothing else flagged. Look, if you got something, bring it in. Official channels, and I'll take a fresh look. But I'm not reopening a closed accidental on a hunch from a private cop with a client who inherits money. I thanked him, which cost me nothing, and hung up, thinking about Dolores Feeney's coffee going cold on the counter, and the particular quiet in her voice when she'd described Corliss's face after he stopped asking about tracing the money. Wolfe was in the office when I got back, an orchid catalog open in front of him that I doubted he was actually reading, and I laid it all out. Fairhaven Partners, the labor dispute nobody finished reporting, Corliss's late-night question about tracing money, the timeline that put his suspicion a week before his death. Wolfe listened with his eyes shut, and when I finished, he was quiet long enough that I thought he might have actually dozed off, which he does sometimes, as a kind of insult to a slow report. Then his eyes opened. Mr. Corliss discovered where his $400,000 actually went, he said, and it disturbed him enough to break a habit of discretion held for 31 years. A week later he was dead, intoxicated to a degree his own niece insists was impossible for him, in a building with no witnesses and no forced entry, because as Mr. Stebbins rightly notes, people walk in and out of office buildings all day, and a familiar face raises no alarm at all. He folded his hands. Archie, find out who has business at that building after hours, and find out precisely who controls Fairhaven Partners. A silent investor group, hiding behind a law firm 2 blocks from Vance and Ashford's own offices, is not, I think, an accident of geography. Walter Grissom did not want to come to the brownstone, and I'll admit, I enjoyed persuading him. I found him on Thursday morning at a diner 2 blocks from the Hartford Mill, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the sunken, defeated look of an owner who no longer owns much of anything, whatever the county clerk's filing said. It took some doing. A mention of the Gazette, a mention of Lieutenant Stebbins, a carefully vague suggestion that a private conversation in New York was considerably more pleasant than a public one with the district attorney's office. But by that afternoon, he was sitting in Wolfe's office in a suit that had fit him better 10 years and 30 pounds ago, looking like a man who'd been marched somewhere against his better judgment, which he had. I don't know what you think I did, Grissom said, before Wolfe had finished settling into his chair. I have formed no theory regarding you specifically, Wolfe said. I understand you are the owner of record of Perryman Textiles. I understand also that the real authority over that company rests with an entity called Fairhaven Partners, of which you are, I suspect, considerably less than an owner and considerably more than an employee. Correct me? Grissom's hands, thick and spotted, worked against each other in his lap. Fairhaven put capital into the mill 2 years ago when the bank was about to foreclose. I kept my name on the paper because it kept the workers calmer. A familiar face, you understand, better than some holding company nobody's heard of. And when $400,000 arrived from a personal investor named Sheldon Corliss 8 months ago, where did it go? The question landed the way Wolfe likes his questions to land, direct, unhedged, and aimed at the one soft spot a man hasn't finished bracing. Grissom's face did something complicated, and I watched it happen the way I watch a fighter's shoulders before he throws a punch he doesn't want to throw. To the company, he said. Operating capital. Mr. Corliss did not believe that, in the final week of his life, and Mr. Corliss was, by every account I've gathered, a meticulous man who did not form beliefs carelessly. Wolfe's voice hadn't risen at all, which somehow made it worse. The workers at your mill were promised, some 7 months ago, that fresh capital would stabilize their positions. 2 months after that promise, 60% of them were laid off, regardless. I would like to know, Mr. Grissom, where $400,000 goes when it does not go to payroll, and does not go to equipment, and does not by any visible measure go to the company whose name is stamped on the transfer. Grissom's jaw worked for a moment before anything came out. I don't control Fairhaven's disbursements. I told you, I'm a name on paper. You want to know where the money actually went? You're asking the wrong man, Mr. Wolfe. And I'd be careful who you ask that question to in my position, because I've got a family and a mortgage, and I'm not eager to end up an accident on somebody's staircase myself. That last part came out fast, unplanned, the kind of sentence a frightened man says before he's finished deciding whether to say it. And the room went quiet enough that I heard the elevator groan somewhere upstairs. That's an interesting fear to volunteer, Wolfe said softly, for a man who claims no knowledge of how Mr. Corliss did. Corliss died. I read the papers same as anyone. But Grissom's color had gone bad, gray under the diner tan, and his eyes went to the door the way a man's eyes go to an exit when the room has stopped feeling safe. I've said what I know. I keep the mill running, I sign what I'm told to sign, and I don't ask Fairhaven questions, because the 2 times I did, I got told very politely that my cooperation was appreciated and my curiosity was not. Told by whom? The lawyer who handles their filings. Coleman, over on Lex. That's as high up the chain as I've ever gotten. And frankly, Mr. Wolfe, that's as high up the chain as I intend to try to get. Whatever you're paying that man in the doorway to write down everything I say. He nodded at me without looking at me, which was fine. I'd already gotten Coleman's name down, underlined it twice. Wolfe let him go 20 minutes later, having extracted little else beyond the name. But the name was the whole morning's harvest, and worth more than an hour of denials. Because a lawyer who tells a frightened frontman to stop asking questions is a lawyer worth asking questions of himself. Ashford came back that evening, this time at Wolfe's summons rather than his own initiative, and he came in with less polish than his first visit, tie a shade looser, the tan looking more like a strain than a leisure. I understand you've been in Hartford, he said, settling into the red chair with the particular stiffness of a man trying to look relaxed. Emmett tells me you've dragged some mill owner into this. I have to say, Mr. Wolfe, this is exactly the kind of overreach I was afraid of. Mr. Grissom volunteered unprompted, a fear that he might himself become an accident on somebody's staircase, Wolfe said, watching him. That is not the sentence of a man discussing an ordinary business arrangement. Tell me about Fairhaven Partners, Mr. Ashford, I've never heard of Fairhaven Partners. Flat, immediate, the kind of denial that comes too fast to have required any actual thought. Their registered agent is a firm 2 blocks from your own offices. New York is full of law firms 2 blocks from my offices, Mr. Wolfe. That is not evidence of anything, except that Manhattan real estate is expensive. Ashford's jaw had tightened. I've told you what I know about Perriman. Sheldon made an investment I didn't approve of, in a company I'd never heard of, through channels he deliberately kept from me. If there's some deeper arrangement behind it, I promise you, I'm as ignorant of it as you claim to be curious about it. I claim nothing, Wolfe said. I observe that Mr. Corliss, 1 week before his death, asked his bookkeeper whether a wire transfer could be traced past its immediate recipient, and that he grew visibly disturbed by whatever answer he arrived at on his own. I observe that you have, on 2 occasions now, described your late partner as a man whose judgment had deteriorated, drinking, secretive, unreliable, despite every other witness describing precisely the opposite man. And I observe that a frightened mill owner in Hartford invoked unprompted the image of a staircase. Ashford stood up. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voice, no slammed hand on the desk, but it was fast, the motion of a man who'd decided the conversation had crossed some line he wasn't willing to sit still for. I came here voluntarily, Mr. Wolfe, out of respect for my partner's memory and my regard for Emmett, and I'm being interrogated like a suspect in my own late colleague's death. because a fat detective has decided a coincidence of law firms means something. I have a business to run. If you have an actual accusation, make it to the police, and I'll bring my attorney to answer it there. Until then, I'd appreciate you directing your imagination elsewhere. He left without waiting to be shown out, and I heard the front door close harder than the hinges strictly required. Wolfe sat with his eyes closed for a good minute after the sound faded, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression I'd learned, over the years, to recognize as satisfaction disguised as fatigue. A man who has nothing to hide, Archie, he said, does not stand up. He asks further questions, out of simple curiosity about an accusation that doesn't concern him. Mr. Ashford stood up. He reached for the orchid catalog again, though I doubted now more than ever that he was reading it. Tomorrow you will find this lawyer, Coleman, and you will discover, if you can, whether Mr. Ashford has any private financial difficulties that a partnership salary, however comfortable, might not entirely cover. A man's tan does not pay his debts. Coleman turned out to be a man named Preston Coleman, senior partner at a firm called Coleman, Whitfield & Strauss, and getting past his secretary took more charm than I'd budgeted for the morning. I finally got in by leaving a card that said I was inquiring on behalf of a client regarding the disposition of Fairhaven Partners' recent capital activities, which was vague enough to be true and specific enough to worry a man whose whole career depended on nobody looking too closely at exactly that. He saw me at 4, in an office with more leather than a saddlery, and he was smoother than Grissom by a wide margin. The kind of smooth that comes from 30 years of being paid to say nothing in complete, reassuring sentences. I represent a number of investment entities, Mr. Goodwin. I'm not in a position to discuss client matters, and frankly, I'm not sure what client you're referring to. Fairhaven Partners, registered 2 blocks from here, majority stake in a Hartford mill called Perriman Textiles, which took in $400,000 from a man named Sheldon Corliss 8 months ago. Fell down some stairs with enough liquor in him to embalm a horse, which several people who knew him say is impossible, because the man didn't drink. Coleman's expression didn't move, but his hand, resting on the desk blotter, went still in a way that told me the stillness was work. I'm sorry to hear of Mr. Corliss's passing. I don't see what it has to do with my firm. Neither do I yet. That's why I'm here instead of the district attorney's office, which is where I go next, if you'd rather not have the conversation now. I let that sit a second. Walter Grissom tells me you're the one who told him to stop asking questions about where Fairhaven's money actually goes. That's a strange instruction to give an ostensible business owner, unless there's something downstream of Fairhaven that Fairhaven doesn't want its own front man looking at too closely. For the first time, something shifted behind Coleman's eyes. Not fear exactly, more the calculation of a man deciding how much silence was still affordable. Fairhaven Partners is a holding vehicle for several private investors who prefer, as is their right, not to have their names attached to a struggling textile operation. That's neither unusual nor illegal, Mr. Goodwin. I manage their filings. I don't manage their business decisions, and I certainly don't manage Mr. Grissom's disposition of company funds, which is between him and the board. Names, I said. Give me one, and I'll believe the rest of the arrangement is as boring as you're making it sound. Coleman almost smiled. I'm not able to disclose client identities, and I think you know that, Mr. Goodwin, which is why you're asking so directly. You're hoping I'll slip. I won't. If your client has a genuine grievance, they're welcome to pursue it through appropriate legal channels, and I'll respond appropriately when I'm served with something that requires a response. Until then, this conversation is concluded. I didn't get a name, but I got something almost as good on my way out. His secretary, refiling a folder while I waited for the elevator, had left a client ledger open on her desk, long enough for me to read, upside down, 3 lines of a column labeled Disbursement Authorization, before she noticed me looking, and closed it. One of the 3 initials in that column was D.A., which could have meant a dozen things, but I filed it next to David Ashford's name and let it sit there uncomfortably. I spent the rest of the afternoon on Ashford himself, and here the digging paid off faster than I'd expected. A friend of mine, who clerks at a downtown bank, owed me a favor going back to a poker debt I'd forgiven 2 years ago, and over a beer that evening he told me, off the books and unofficially, that David Ashford had taken out 2 substantial personal loans in the past year against his apartment and a summer property in Connecticut, and that as of the most recent quarter, he was carrying debt that would have surprised anyone who'd seen the tan and the suits and assumed the obvious. Man's living about 40% past what the partnership actually pays him, my friend said. I don't know where the difference is coming from, but it's coming from somewhere, and it isn't the firm's books, because I pulled those too, quietly, and they're clean. That put a different shape on things. A partner with debts he was covering through some channel outside the firm's visible income, and a firm 2 blocks from a law office managing an anonymous holding company that had swallowed $400,000 of his dead partner's dollars without a visible trace. It wasn't proof of anything Wolfe would accept as proof. Wolfe doesn't deal in the kind of proof a jury needs. He deals in the kind that satisfies his own relentless sense of pattern. But it was a thread, and threads, pulled far enough, tend to unravel whole coats. I got back to the brownstone past 9, past Wolfe's dinner, and well into his evening reading, and laid it out for him. Coleman's careful nothing, the initials D.A. on a disbursement ledger I'd glimpsed for maybe 4 seconds. Ashford's debts running well past his visible income. Wolfe listened with the particular stillness that meant he was building something, brick by reported brick, in that vast and unhurried mind of his. 4 seconds is not testimony, Archie, he said when I'd finished, but it is suggestion, and suggestion layered upon suggestion eventually acquires the weight of conviction, even if it never acquires the precision of proof. A partner in debt beyond his visible means, a holding company managed by a lawyer who instructs a front man to stop asking questions. A dead man who discovered, 1 week before his death, precisely where his charitable investment had actually gone. He set down his book, an orchid monograph, I noted, not fiction, which meant he'd genuinely been reading rather than performing patience. Tomorrow I believe we require Miss Feeney once more, and this time I would like her to bring the Perriman file itself, complete, so that I may see with my own eyes what Mr. Corliss saw with his, 1 week before someone decided his curiosity had become inconvenient. Dolores Feeney came Friday morning with a leather satchel full of transfer records, and Wolfe had her spread them across the desk, while he sat with his eyes shut, listening to her narrate each document rather than reading them himself, which is his preferred method when a paper trail is dense. He says his ears retain sequence better than his eyes retain columns, and after 20 years working for the man I've stopped arguing with his methods, even when I don't follow the logic of them. The first transfer went out in March, she said, $150,000, wired directly from Mr. Corliss's personal account to Perriman Textiles' operating account at Hartford Fidelity. That much is straightforward. It's documented. It's what he told me it was for. The second transfer, in April, is where it gets strange. Strange how? Wolfe asked, eyes still closed. It didn't go to Perriman's operating account at all. It went to an account held by Fairhaven Partners at a different bank entirely, Colonial Trust in Hartford. And from there, 3 days later, $250,000 of it moved again, this time to an account I couldn't trace past a numbered holding entity registered in Delaware. She shuffled papers, and I could hear the faint tremor of a woman still uneasy about her own complicity in a change she hadn't fully understood at the time. I only found that because I finally did what Mr. Corliss asked me to do the week before he died. I traced it as far as the bank would let a firm like ours trace anything without a subpoena, which isn't far, but it was far enough to see the money left Perriman's actual operations within 72 hours of arriving. 72 hours. And what remained with Perriman itself? Barely anything. The company's own operating account shows the March transfer being spent down on payroll and materials over the following months, exactly as promised. But the April transfer, the larger one, essentially passed through Perryman like a river through a sieve. It touched the company's books for 3 days, and then it was gone, routed through Fairhaven to Delaware, and I have no way of knowing where it went after that, without legal authority I don't have. But Mr. Corliss suspected. He didn't just suspect, Mr. Wolfe. I think by the time he asked me that last question, whether a transfer could be traced past its recipient, he'd already done some tracing of his own, quietly, without me. Because he asked the question, the way a man asks something he already half knows the answer to, and wants confirmed rather than discovered. Dolores looked up from the papers, and there was something raw in her face. 3 weeks of guilt, finally finding a place to land. I think he found out his $400,000, money meant, as far as he believed, to save workers' jobs, had actually been laundered through his friend's company, and out the other side into somebody's private account. And I think that broke something in him, because he'd put his own name and his own money behind that promise to those workers. And if it was a lie, then he'd been made a liar too, without his knowledge or consent. Wolfe sat with that a long moment, hands folded, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into the register he uses when a case has stopped being an intellectual exercise and started being, in whatever fashion his temperament allows, a matter of genuine indignation. "A foolish thing done for a friend," he said, quoting Marion Thale's memory of her uncle's own words. Not foolish because it was generous, but foolish because his generosity was harvested by someone he trusted, and turned into an instrument of theft against the very workers he believed he was protecting. He looked to Dolores. The friend. Did Mr. Corliss ever name who first brought him the Perryman investment? Who asked this favor of him? He never said, and I never asked directly. It wasn't my place. But I can tell you this. She hesitated, and I could see her weighing something she'd apparently decided not to volunteer until directly asked. The mark of a careful and loyal employee working against her own instinct for discretion. The initial introduction to Perryman came through an email that I saw only because Mr. Corliss forwarded me the wiring instructions attached to it. The email wasn't from anyone at Perryman itself. It was forwarded from Mr. Ashford's private account, with a note above it that just said, "Sheldon, thought of you for this, discreet as discussed." I assumed at the time it was simply Mr. Ashford passing along an investment tip between partners. I didn't think anything of it, until now. The room went very quiet. Outside, somewhere on 35th Street, a horn sounded twice and faded. "You never mentioned this before," Wolfe said, not unkindly, but precisely. "You never asked me who introduced the investment, Mr. Wolfe. You asked me to trace the money. I'm sorry. I didn't think to connect it. Mr. Ashford recommends things to people constantly. It's half his job. And I truly didn't think." She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. "I should have said something sooner." "You've said it now, which is what matters." Wolfe's tone had gentled again. "Thank you, Miss Feeney. You may leave the file with Archie." When she'd gone, I turned to Wolfe, who was sitting with his fingers laced over his stomach, and an expression I can only describe as the look of a chess player who has just watched his opponent's hand move toward a piece he'd already calculated 3 moves ahead of. "Ashford introduced Corliss to Perryman," I said. "Ashford has debts running past his visible income, and initials that look a lot like DA show up on a disbursement authorization at the law firm managing Fairhaven's filings. Ashford introduced the investment, discreetly, to a partner whose trust in him ran 3 decades deep," Wolfe said slowly, building the theory aloud, the way he does when he wants me to follow the architecture rather than simply receive the conclusion. "Ashford, I would wager, is not merely an investor in Fairhaven Partners. He is very likely one of its principal beneficiaries, using the anonymity of a holding company to extract capital from a failing mill. He publicly professes to have advised his partner against ever funding. A neat position, Archie. Publicly skeptical, privately profiting." And when Mr. Corliss began asking Dolores Feeney questions that threatened to trace the money past its intended destination, Mr. Ashford faced the prospect of exposure. Theft from his own partner, theft that implicated him directly. likely criminal, certainly ruinous to both his finances and his standing. So he killed him. I do not yet know that he killed him, Wolfe said, with the particular caution he reserves for the gap between a compelling theory and an actual demonstrable fact. I know that he had motive sufficient to fell a mountain. And I know that a man who stood up from that chair, rather than ask a single further question, is a man whose composure had already failed him once this week. But motive is not method, Archie. And I have neither placed him at that stairwell, nor accounted for how a sober man of Mr. Corliss's habits came to have enough liquor in his blood to render him helpless. He reached for the bell to summon beer, which meant the analytical portion of the afternoon had concluded, and the digestive portion was about to begin. Tomorrow, I believe, we test him. Not with accusation. Mr. Ashford has demonstrated he can withstand accusation by simply leaving the room. We will need something considerably more difficult for him to walk away from. The test Wolfe devised required 3 days of preparation, a small deception of Lieutenant Stebbins, and a favor from Lon Cohen that I suspect cost me more future favors than I'd like to admit. But by Monday evening, everything was arranged the way Wolfe wanted it, which is to say, arranged so that a guilty man would walk into it believing he'd arrived by his own choice. The bait was simple enough in concept, elaborate in execution. Wolfe had Fritz plant a notice, through Lon in the Gazette's business section, small type, easy to miss unless you were looking for exactly this, announcing that sources close to the estate of Sheldon Corliss had engaged forensic accountants to conduct a full audit of the deceased's final financial transactions, including certain investments that raised questions prior to Mr. Corliss's death. It named no names, it made no accusations. It was, on its face, the kind of routine estate settlement item that runs in small type and gets read by nobody except the people who have specific reasons to read the business section closely on a Monday. If Mr. Ashford's conscience is clean, Wolfe had told me, he will read this notice, if he reads it at all, with mild professional interest and nothing more. If his conscience is not clean, he will read it as I intend it to be read, as the sound of a door closing on whatever remaining time he believed he had. Ashford called the brownstone himself Tuesday morning, and there was a different register in his voice than either of his previous visits. Less irritation, more of something that a careful listener, which I like to think I am, would have called strain, wearing a very thin coat of composure. I understand there's an audit underway, he said, when I put him through to Wolfe's line. Emmett didn't mention authorizing anything of the kind. Mr. Vance did not authorize it, Wolfe said, which was true, since the audit didn't exist. I did, as part of my ongoing inquiry, which your client is paying for, and which I am under no obligation to clear through you, Mr. Ashford. Forensic accountants are tedious people. They trace things. I understand they've already made some progress regarding the Delaware entity your Fairhaven transfers eventually reached. There was a silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. I'd like to come in, Ashford said finally. This afternoon, if that's possible. I think there are things I should clarify for the sake of the estate, before this goes any further in a direction that could embarrass people unnecessarily. 4 o'clock, Wolfe said, and hung up before Ashford could add anything further, which is Wolfe's preferred way of ending a call he considers already won. He arrived at 4 exactly, and the tan looked worse under the office lights than it had a week earlier. Not faded, but somehow ill-fitting, like a coat put on over a body that had lost weight beneath it. He sat without the easy sprawl of his first visit, spine straight, hands flat on his knees. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Wolfe, because I think discretion has stopped serving me well. He glanced at me, then back to Wolfe, and something in the glance told me he'd decided I was furniture he'd have to accept rather than furniture he could dismiss. I do have an interest in Fairhaven Partners, a minority position arranged 2 years ago when the mill needed capital and I helped structure the financing. I didn't disclose it to Emmett or to Sheldon because partnership rules prohibit outside investments that could constitute a conflict. And frankly, I was embarrassed by how badly the mill had performed. I didn't want my judgment questioned. A prohibited investment is a matter for your partnership agreement, Wolfe said. It is not, on its own, a matter for me. Tell me about the April transfer. Ashford's jaw tightened. I didn't route Sheldon's money anywhere. I introduced him to the investment because I genuinely believed at the time that fresh capital could save the mill and the jobs attached to it. I had no control over how Fairhaven's board, and I want to stress, Mr. Wolfe, it is a board, not merely myself, dispersed those funds once they arrived. If money was diverted improperly, that happened above my authority, not because of it. Yet your personal finances, Wolfe said, reflect income considerably beyond what your partnership salary would explain. Over roughly the same period, the mill's own workers went unpaid, despite a capital infusion meant to secure their positions. That landed the way Wolfe had built it to land, not as an accusation precisely, but as a fact laid on the desk between them, with the flat, unhurried certainty that meant Wolfe already believed he knew what it proved. Ashford's hands, flat on his knees, curled slightly. I want a lawyer present before I discuss my personal finances further, he said. You are welcome to summon one, Wolfe said. I would remind you, however, that Lieutenant Stebbins of the New York Police has, as of this morning, become considerably more interested in the circumstances of Mr. Corliss's death than he was 3 weeks ago, following certain information Mr. Goodwin conveyed to him regarding a Delaware holding entity and a disbursement ledger bearing initials that closely resemble your own. It will not, I think, answer the question you actually came here to answer today, which is how much I already know. It was a bluff. Stebbins knew nothing yet. That call was scheduled for the following morning, depending on what this conversation produced. But it was built on enough true material underneath it that I watched it land on Ashford like a physical weight. His composure, which had held through Grissom's fear and Coleman's careful nothing, finally showed its first real crack. I didn't kill him, Ashford said, and his voice had dropped, lost its polish entirely, become something closer to a man's actual voice than anything I'd heard from him yet. I want that understood before anything else. Whatever else I've done, I did not kill Sheldon Corliss. Then tell me what you did do, Wolfe said, quiet now himself, the two voices in the room matching each other's register, in a way that felt to me like the whole conversation had finally arrived at its real floor. Precisely, Mr. Ashford, and without further architecture around the truth. You have exhausted my patience for architecture. Ashford sat for a long moment, looking at his own hands, as though they belonged to someone whose choices he was only now fully reckoning with. Sheldon confronted me, he said finally, 9 days before he died. He came to my apartment in the evening, which he never did, and he had the transfer records with him, his own copies, the ones he'd apparently been quietly gathering for weeks, and he asked me, very calmly, whether I'd known his money would be diverted before he'd invested it. I told him no. That was true, Mr. Wolfe. I swear that much is true. I didn't know, when I introduced him to Perryman, that Fairhaven's board intended to strip the capital, rather than use it. I found out only after, when my own returns started arriving larger than my stake justified, and by then I told myself it was already done, that saying something would only ruin us both. And what did Mr. Corliss say to that? He said he was going to the district attorney's office, not the police, the DA directly, with the transfer records, and he was going to name Fairhaven, name Coleman, and name me, because I'd introduced him to the whole rotten arrangement, whether or not I'd known its full shape. He said, Ashford's voice caught, genuinely, and for the first time since he'd walked into that office, I believed I was watching something closer to grief than fear. He said 31 years of partnership meant I owed him the truth, and 31 years of partnership meant he owed those mill workers the truth too. And he wasn't going to let one debt cancel the other. He gave me 1 week to come forward myself before he did it for me. And you did not come forward. I called Coleman, told him what Sheldon knew, told him Sheldon intended to go to the DA within the week. Ashford's hands had come up to cover his face briefly, then dropped. I swear to you, Mr. Wolfe, I told Coleman because I wanted his advice on how to get ahead of it. Get a lawyer. Disclose voluntarily. Minimize the damage. I never imagined I never thought Coleman would. He stopped there, and the room went very still. And I realized we had just arrived, by the longest and most careful route Wolfe knew how to build, at the name that had been standing quietly behind every other name in this case since the moment Grissom had said the word staircase, like it already had somebody's blood on it. Wolfe gathered them all in the office on Thursday evening, Vance in the chair nearest the desk, Ashford beside him, looking like a man attending his own inquest, Marion Thale composed but pale near the bookshelves, Dolores Feeney standing rather than sitting, despite Wolfe's invitation, and Walter Grissom, who Wolfe had insisted travel down from Hartford, sitting stiffly by the door, as though he intended to bolt through it the moment things turned uncomfortable. Lieutenant Stebbins stood at the back with his arms folded, having agreed, after considerable persuasion and the promise of an arrest he could actually make, to observe rather than interrupt. Preston Coleman had come last, in a gray overcoat, seated in the one remaining chair with the composed, faintly bored expression of a lawyer attending a meeting he expected to control. He would not control this one, and I don't think, looking back, that anyone in that room besides Wolfe and myself understood that yet. "I have asked you here," Wolfe began, once Fritz had shut the door and the beer had been poured, "to explain how Sheldon Corliss died, and I will do so in the order the truth actually occurred, rather than the order in which it was discovered, because a murder, properly understood, is not a mystery so much as an arithmetic, a sum of pressures that arrived, one after another, at a single unbearable total." He looked first to Grissom. Corliss invested $400,000 in Perryman Textiles, believing the capital would stabilize a failing mill and protect its workers' positions. The bulk of that money was instead diverted, within 72 hours of arrival, through Fairhaven Partners to a Delaware holding entity, from which it was distributed to Fairhaven's principal beneficiaries. Among them, Mr. Ashford, whose minority stake, arranged privately and never disclosed to his partners, entitled him to returns considerably beyond his legitimate income. Ashford didn't look up. Vance's face beside him had gone rigid with a betrayal I suspected would take considerably longer than this evening to fully absorb. 9 days before his death, Wolfe continued, Mr. Corliss confronted Mr. Ashford directly, having independently traced the diversion of his own investment. He gave Mr. Ashford 1 week to disclose the arrangement voluntarily to the district attorney, along with the transfer records he had quietly compiled. Mr. Ashford, in a moment of panic rather than malice, relayed this ultimatum to Mr. Coleman, whose firm manages Fairhaven's filings, and who, I believe, is not merely Fairhaven's attorney, but its architect. The mind who structured the diversion in the first place, and the mind with the most to lose from Mr. Corliss's threatened disclosure. Since a director's improper enrichment is a civil matter, Mr. Coleman, but the deliberate structuring of fraud through shell entities and false disbursement authorizations is considerably more. Coleman's composure had not broken, not visibly, but I'd watched enough men across that office to know the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic of his own, very fast, behind an unmoving face. "This is speculation," Coleman said. "Colorful speculation, delivered with considerable theater, but speculation nonetheless. You have motive. You have no evidence I was anywhere near that building the night Mr. Corliss died." "I have a disbursement ledger," Wolfe said, "on which Mr. Goodwin observed initials resembling Mr. Ashford's, in a column your own secretary left visible. I have a frightened mill owner, who invoked, unprompted, the specific image of a staircase, when discussing his fear of your firm's displeasure. An image he could not have conjured from newspaper accounts, since the method of Mr. Corliss's death, a fall down a service stairwell, was reported, but the detail of his intoxication being medically implausible was not, and yet Mr. Grissom's fear attached itself specifically to a staircase, rather than any other manner of harm. That is not proof, Mr. Coleman, I grant you, But it is a thread, and I pulled it. He nodded to me, and this was the part we'd arranged carefully with Stebbins the night before. Mr. Corliss's building has a service entrance used by delivery personnel and maintenance staff after the lobby closes, accessible by a side door that residents and staff alike prop open during evening deliveries, as buildings of that vintage in that neighborhood invariably do. Lieutenant Stebbins was kind enough this week to have his people recanvass the building's neighbors, not the staff interviewed the first time, who saw nothing unusual because nothing unusual to them occurred, but the doorman at the building directly adjacent, whose stoop overlooks that same service entrance. Stebbins, from the back of the room, spoke for the first time. Doorman remembered a man in a gray overcoat entering that side door around 9:15 the night Corliss died, and leaving maybe 40 minutes later. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured he was a resident's guest or maintenance. But we showed him a photograph yesterday. His eyes went to Coleman. He picked you out without hesitation. The room had gone very still. Coleman's hand, I noticed, had found the arm of his chair, and gripped it the way Vance's hand had gripped his own knee 3 weeks earlier. The grip of a careful man, discovering that carefulness has limits. Mr. Corliss did not drink, Wolfe said, into that stillness. You knew this, presumably, from whatever research a man in your position conducts on a threat before deciding how to neutralize it. You went to his building that evening, gained entry through a service door habitually propped for deliveries, and you found him, I would guess, in his office, working late, as Miss Feeney's records suggest was his habit in his final anxious weeks. You did not need violence, Mr. Coleman, merely persuasion and patience, a bottle perhaps offered as a peace gesture, a toast to resolving matters amicably, and a man polite enough, even in suspicion of the person offering it, to accept a single glass rather than cause a scene. One glass, heavily dosed, followed by enough additional persuasion, verbal or otherwise, to ensure he consumed considerably more before you walked him, unsteady and uncomprehending, to the head of that service stairwell, and allowed gravity to complete what you'd begun. You cannot possibly prove any of that, Coleman said, and his voice, for the first time, had lost its courtroom smoothness entirely. Perhaps not to a legal certainty, tonight, in this room, Wolfe conceded. But Lieutenant Stebbins now has a witness placing you at that building at the relevant hour. A documented motive in the fraud your own client ledger will eventually confirm under proper subpoena. And a victim whose closest relations will testify, unanimously, that he did not drink. Testimony that will make the medical examiner's findings considerably harder for a jury to dismiss as an accident, once presented as what they actually were. I do not need to prove murder in this office, Mr. Coleman. I need only demonstrate enough for Lieutenant Stebbins to justify what he is, I believe, already prepared to do. Stebbins was already moving, and Coleman, to his credit or his ruin, didn't resist. Just sat there for one long moment, with the particular stillness of a man watching a very careful life come apart at a seam he'd never expected anyone to find. Before Stebbins had him on his feet and reciting rites I'd heard recited often enough in that office to nearly mouth along. They cleared out slowly after that. Grissom first, looking 10 years lighter than he had walking in. Ashford last, pausing at the door to say something to Vance that I didn't catch and that Vance didn't answer, which told its own story about the shape their partnership would take from here, if it survived at all. Marion Thale stopped beside my desk on her way out. Was it worth it? She asked. All of it? For $400,000 and a mill that's probably finished anyway? Wasn't really about the mill by the end, I said. It was about a man who couldn't let a lie sit still once he'd found it. Your uncle wasn't foolish, Miss Thale. He was just honest, in a business full of people who'd learned not to be. She almost smiled at that. The first real one I'd seen from her, and left with something that looked, if not like peace, at least like the beginning of it. Wolfe was already back behind his desk, the orchid catalog open again. Genuinely reading this time, I thought. now that the actual reading he'd been doing all week, of men, of silences, of a widow's eye grip on a knee, and a lawyer's hand on a chair arm, had finally come to its close. "Beer, Archie," he said, without looking up. "And then I believe Fritz has something involving duck that deserves considerably more of my attention than Mr. Coleman has received tonight." I poured it myself, because some victories are worth serving in person, and thought that Sheldon Corliss, wherever careful, honest men go, would probably have approved of a case that ended not with vengeance, but with arithmetic. A sum of pressures, finally, correctly totaled.